But boy, this next case, wow, this one is amazing. I found it really emotionally touching, actually. I call this one Don't Look Up. This occurred in 1947, right at the dawn of the modern age of UFOs, near Langley. This is in British Columbia, Canada. And this one involves the praying mantis type ETs. And yes, there's some very extensive interactions with this one, and it's a very unusual case for sure. This case comes from well-respected and pioneering researcher Graham Conway of the UFO British Columbia UFO Group, UFO BC, and it involves a witness who has insisted upon absolute anonymity. In fact, he only came forward to share his encounter many years after it happened. It affected him quite profoundly. As he says, "Some of the terror has lessened, and although it has been blanked out of my life, I would have flashbacks and relive it." So yeah, this really affected him. And here's what happened. It was a hot day in the spring or summer of 1947. The witness was 16 years old. At the time, he lived with his brother and mother on the border of Cloverdale and Langley. This is in British Columbia, Canada, along what would be called the Trans-Canada Highway. At this time, it was a very rural area with very few homes, lots of trees, and flat farmland. Now, the witness and his younger brother were outside playing in the creek that ran by their home. His younger brother was actually in the creek catching minnows, while the witness sat under a nearby tree reading a book. And as the witness says, it was very quiet. I had heard a hum, but I thought nothing of it. The next I knew, a silver gray, and what I know of today was a UFO, sat down right in front of me. So this affected him in a very weird way. The witness says he fell into what he calls a, quote, blank state. He kind of kept slipping in and out of consciousness. And this went on for some time. He estimates about an hour, but he's really not sure. But he certainly did see what happened next. As he says in his own words, "A door opened, I believe from bottom to top, and out walked 4 or 5 grotesque creatures, looking like praying mantis, wearing dull silver gray body-fitted coverings. No buttons, zippers, nothing. By this time I had stood up, and I still held my book. One creature came right to me and stood looking at me, took my book and looked at it. It put its hands on my shoulder. It could read my thoughts. Everything I thought of, it knew. It was so terrifying. It looked into my eyes deeply, and I am certain I could hear the black eyes click, just like a camera. Now when this happened, he suddenly felt this weird wave of calmness. From behind him, he heard his mother shouting at him frantically, and he told her to get away, telling her that she might get shot if she didn't go back into the house, which she did. Now, the witness then had the distinct impression that, quote, they were here due to the wars and bombs, end quote. At this point, the creature left the witness and rejoined the others, all of who began to walk around the UFO inspecting it. And the witness had the impression that there was a problem with the front door area. He feels quite sure about this and that they were trying to fix it. He did notice that there were many cars passing along the highway, pretty much in full view of the object, and he thought to himself, the silly fools, meaning the ETs, don't they realize someone driving by will be able to see them and the large silver dome? So this was quite a large craft apparently. But strangely, no cars stopped. In fact, nobody appeared to see this large craft or the mantid beings. The encounter wasn't over yet. As the witness says, the creature came right back to me, looked into my eyes, and that hand on my shoulder said by telepathy, "We are leaving now. Do not look up, do not look up, do not look up." My head was down on my chest, and the next thing I heard was a hum. I thought, yes, I can look up. I will look up. And there it was, at the top of the tree, right over my head, going up quickly into a sky that had about 4 military planes going faster than I have ever seen. So he's watching this UFO leave. He sees all these planes. He could hear them roaring quite loudly. They were all chasing after the craft. He decided at this point that other people must have seen the craft, otherwise why would the planes be there? But as he watched, the UFO quickly outdistanced the jets, darting off to the south towards Washington state. Now once it had left, he called out to his little brother, who appeared to be in a trance, just standing there in the creek. As the witness says, he did not move. I had to step into the creek, take him by the hand, call his name, and said, "We will go home now." So the two boys went inside, and this is when they discovered that their mother was quite angry that they had stayed out so long. The witness and his brother reported at this point that they had an unquenchable thirst and could not drink enough water. The witness then went directly to bed. He says that upon waking, he found that his skin was bright red, painful. Aspirin, he said, did little to relieve the pain, and this affected him for days, if not weeks. He remained pretty much in bed for a few weeks. Finally, after he was able to get up and walk around, he looked outside of the house, and he did discover evidence that a craft had in fact landed where he saw it. As he says, "I could see from the kitchen window a large circle of burnt or black grass. 3 months later, we moved away. I have never spoken to anyone about this, and find it very hard to write about. I started a journal a few years ago and could not finish it." Now the witness said that he had to condense this story, which he wrote in a letter to Graham Conway, and that there were quite a few more details to it. Thanks again to Graham Conway for bringing this case to us. I do wish the witness had provided the full story, because apparently there's more to it, and I really wonder about that. There are cases where these objects actually follow school buses as well. One case occurred in December 1976 outside of Whitehorse. This is in the Yukon area of Canada. And the main witness is a school bus driver and her daughter. This school bus driver became concerned because this object started to appear and pace her school bus. Happened not once or twice, but multiple times over a period of over a month. Many of the students saw this object as well. It always kind of paced the bus from a distance, but still made her nervous enough that she told the school that she would like to change her route and get a different route. The school granted her the change, and it didn't work. She was driving her new route, and this object still showed up. One time she's driving home with her daughter. They're the only ones in the school bus when this object approaches again. This time it comes much closer, and they stop, and this time it approaches right in front of their school bus, and there's a big porthole, and they can see humanoids, figures, silhouettes looking at them through this window. It scared them very badly, but that turned out to be the climax of the event, and following this, they stopped being followed by this UFO. But it's certainly not the only school bus incident, or even one that occurred at a school bus stop. So let's just get started. First case I want to talk about today, I call Contact in Calgary. Again, this is not a very well-known case. It occurred on November 17, 1967 in a suburb in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And this is a single witness case. It's very interesting because while the witness did undergo hypnosis to recall some of the details of his experience, he initially did have missing time, but remembered it spontaneously through a dream. And this is what actually prompted him to undergo hypnosis. It's a really fascinating and unusual case. This case comes from researcher William K. Allen and was also published in an article, Contactee Supplies New Clues to the UFO Mystery, which was written by B. Ann Slate and appeared in the April 1976 issue of UFO Report. The sole witness in this case is 13-year-old David Seawalt. He had gone to visit a friend's home where the two boys did some weightlifting, and then at 5:45 p.m., again on November 17, 1967, David began what should have been a 3-minute walk back to his home in Calgary. But of course, that's not what happened. As he was crossing a vacant lot, an empty field, he heard a high-pitched sound coming from above, and looking up, he saw a craft he said was about the size of a house, hovering only maybe 30 to 40 feet overhead. It was silver gray. It had a band of green, yellow, blue, orange, red, and pink lights around the edge, all of which seemed to be blending into each other. So this frightened him. David ran, and the craft began to follow him. Suddenly, as he's running away, it shot an orange beam of light right at him. It came from the bottom of the craft. Dazed and frightened, David continued to run straight home. In fact, he dashed into the front door. He was missing one of his shoes. He ran upstairs and hid under his bed. His sister Angela found him hiding there and saw that his eyes were glazed and he appeared to be in shock. So she shook him, asked him what happened, and he told her, "I've been chased by a flying saucer." It was now 6:30 p.m., so there were over 40 minutes of time that he could not account for. His parents, of course, heard the story and became very concerned, especially because over the next few days, David, who was normally a calm boy, was very nervous and uneasy. So his sister Angela later retraced David's path home, and she found his shoe in the middle of the road. His parents decided to find a UFO researcher, and they located William K. Allen, who, only 3 days after David's encounter, did a recorded interview with him. And as William says, "I taped his description of what he believed happened." And that's where the case sat for about 5 months. Then, on April 21st, 1968, David experienced a very vivid and realistic nightmare, his first dream about this incident, where he basically relived the encounter. Only this time, he did recall being taken on board this craft. At the time he was having this dream, David was thrashing around in bed, and he was woken up by his younger brother, who was concerned about this. And upon awakening, David told his little brother, "Call Dad. Now I know what happened when I was chased by the UFO." So this dream gave David only partial recall of being pulled on board and seeing what he called, quote, monsters. He recalled being physically examined. But later, David did agree to undergo hypnosis by a dental surgeon by the name of Dr. Kolvitz, who used hypnosis in his practice. So they were hoping that he could recall more of what happened. So Dr. Kolvitz first suggested that perhaps David had concocted the whole story as an excuse for coming home late. David hostilely denied this, and in fact his mother confirmed that David had always been home on time. A psychologist by the name of Dr. Masson and the researcher William K. Allen also attended this hypnosis session. And under hypnosis, David was taken back to the incident, and he immediately began to experience an intense fear. In fact, he perspired profusely. He started wringing his hands. His whole body started shaking. He was unable to speak or get past the memory block. Finally, the hypnotist suggested that David try to remember the events as though he was watching TV. This technique worked. David began to remember. He recalled seeing this UFO, trying to run, being struck by the beam of light, and then, as David says, "I was sort of in a trance. The beam just brought me up into the ship." Now, inside this craft, he was immediately confronted by two, he says, scary-looking, non-human entities with a sort of reptilian-like appearance. As David says, it has scaly skin. It looked like crocodile skin, sort of rough all over. It has holes for its nose and holes for its ears. It has a slit on its face for a mouth. It's brown. So the beings were very clinical as they undressed David, placed him on a table, and began to examine him. And as David says in his own words, they didn't show any expression. They put me on sort of a cot. He's looking at my body. He's studying it. He took all my clothes off. They're bringing me through a hallway into another room. It has all sorts of bright lights in it. There's another table. They put me on that table. He's lifting my head up. He looks at my hair in my eyes, in my nose. They put this other thing over me. It's a grayish color, and they just throw it over me. And then this great big huge orange-colored light comes down and is shown on me. So David could now see that there were actually 4 of these beings, all who looked pretty much the same. Each was about 6 feet tall. He said that they had round heads, 4 fingers on each hand. They did not appear to be wearing anything as far as he could tell. And he said he could hear them talking in a strange language, which sounded like sort of just a buzzing noise to him. He says they took a small gray instrument, sort of like a needle-like device, and stuck it in his arm, but he felt no pain. As he says, I felt, quote, funny, numb. At this point, the examination was over. The beings put his clothes back on. He was taken out from the room, and then, as he says, quote, they beamed me down in the empty lot. So he's thoroughly frightened at this point. His body is still partly numb, his head is swirling, and he ran home as fast as he could. The psychologist, Dr. Masson, learned that David had earlier undergone an appendectomy. This was in 4th grade. And he questioned David about it and learned that one of the doctors was old and had wrinkled skin, and developed this crazy theory that David's hypnotic recall was really just a subconscious memory of his appendectomy. Now, researcher William K. Allen replied, in this way, I can no way concur. I highly doubt that this witness had a hallucination or a fabrication of his prior appendectomy surgery. That really makes no sense whatsoever, and it certainly doesn't explain the missing time. I think that's just a debunking explanation coming from a skeptic who can't quite wrap his mind around the fact that these things do happen. There are a lot of cases coming from all over the world. It's certainly a remarkable case. This one's super fascinating. It is a single witness case without any real evidence to it, though it does have some sort of interesting corroborative evidence, which is peripherally related, I guess. I call this one the E.T. who walked on water. That alone, I think, makes this case really unusual. This one occurred in May of 1999 in Corner Brook. This is in Newfoundland, Canada. And a very close-up encounter that seemed quite fortuitous, with some interesting premonitions involved with it. So yeah, some real interesting and unusual aspects to this case, especially what the ET was doing. Ryan Vike is the main researcher in this case. He's from Canada. He's investigated a whole lot of encounters, and he received a written report from this witness who requested total anonymity. This case took place in a very rural area immediately outside of the town of Corner Brook in Newfoundland, Canada, where incidentally the witness says he's had a few odd experiences. But this main one occurred one afternoon in May of 1999 when he was taking a walk. He was going up this long, low mountain area when a feeling of, quote, uneasiness came over him. In fact, it was so strong it prompted him to cut his walk short. And instead of walking back the way he came, for some odd reason, he took a shortcut, which required him to slog his way through this marshy area towards where he had parked his car. He was about 5 minutes away from his car when another strange impulse overcame him. This feeling of uneasiness was now gone, but for some reason he decided to make a quick stop at a nearby pond known as 3 Mile Dam. He had often sat here and enjoyed the nature, watching baby beavers and their parents frolicking in this lake. And I'll just quote the witness directly. As he says, I have to preface this with the fact that I have never had any experiences like this before or since. I don't hallucinate. I'm not medicated. I don't drink or do drugs. What I saw was so shocking, it affected everything in my life. I walked up the path, and as I was nearing the pond, something caught my attention. I saw a tall white humanoid figure hovering just over the surface of the water. This thing was about 20 meters in front of me and seemed to be in a trance-like state, just floating in the air. It sounds crazy, but it was solid and big, and dressed in a white suit from head to toe, and had what looked like a gray shield over where its eyes would be. A pure white suit with a dark shield. I was terrified. I was so scared that I was paralyzed. And the moment I could move, I turned slowly and started to walk along the side of the pond. By this time, the being had sort of awakened out of this trance. It was suspended, not moving, until it noticed me, and we acknowledged each other. And without so much as a splash of water, it was on the other side of the pond opposite to me. It glided silently across the pond's surface very fast, and I clearly heard twigs and branches breaking as it moved quickly through the woods. I have never run so fast in my life. I ran back to the car and drove back to Corner Brook, and I wasn't sure who to tell. Weird stuff. So we did finally find Brian Vike and reported his encounter. And regarding his previous weird experiences that he had in this area, he said that in 1994, he and his mom were walking in this same location when suddenly his dog ran off to bark at something. So they followed the dog and they came upon a group of small trees, spruce, birch, and willow trees, which had been mysteriously bent at a 90-degree angle and appeared to be woven around each other and swirled in a counterclockwise direction at about waist height. These were not big trees. They were about 2 to 10 inches in diameter. But, as the witness says, it struck us as extremely odd in that none of the trees were snapped. Now, there is a water treatment plant and a dam next to this area, again, which is known to attract ETs. So perhaps that was the draw here in this case. How crazy is that? This humanoid figure just floating inches above the water looked to the witness almost like it was walking on water. But no, it was apparently levitating. While he didn't see a UFO, given that this figure was wearing this skin-tight jumpsuit, covered its entire body, a helmet with a visor, doesn't sound like a ghostly figure. And also super interesting is that there's a little hydroelectric plant in this area. Again, as we saw in a previous case, this is something that ETs do seem to be attracted to, studying or checking out for one reason or another. Just an overall interesting case, and especially the event before it, where the witness was walking with his mother and saw what looked like a little UFO landing nest, for lack of a better word, landing traces. Of course, he can't connect it directly to this encounter, but I wonder about it because, again, this area with the hydroelectric plant, that makes sense. And here's another case which was professionally investigated. It is a multiple witness case. It does have physical evidence of different types and a quite long encounter as well. And I call this one, "They Are Martians." And that is a direct quote from one of the witnesses. This took place in late July of 1969 in Trois-Rivières in Quebec, Canada. And yeah, it is a thrilling case which was quite traumatic for the witnesses involved. Again, it was late July 1969 when a group of teenagers parked near a reservoir outside of the town of Trois-Rivières in Quebec. And around 9 p.m. they were just preparing to leave, but one of their 2 cars that they had taken there wouldn't start. So some of the teenagers left in the car that was working to go get help, and they left 3 others, aged 12 to 16, alone in the car that wouldn't start. So now alone, the 3 teenagers saw this bright light behind a grove of fir trees, and looking up, saw this classic saucer with a dome on top. And as one of the witnesses says, the 3 of us were looking at this funny thing, asking ourselves, what the hell is that? So they were staring at it when shortly later, a group of 8, quote, luminous beings appeared. They were floating just a foot or 2 off the ground and had a very strange appearance. The closest thing they could compare it to was that these beings looked almost like snowmen, but had no eyes or mouth. Now at this point, they realized these are not humans. and one of the kids shouts out, "They are Martians!" And this is when the beings approached the car, floating in a single line towards them. This really freaked the kids out. They bundled up into the back seat and hid under a blanket as the entities surrounded the car, and according to the witnesses, kept trying to get inside the car because they could hear them knocking around at the doors. The youngest, the 12-year-old, began crying, and as one of the witnesses says, they were as white as light from a neon tube. They floated in the air. They were between 6 and 7 feet tall. I could make out where their face was by an oval shape, but I didn't see any eyes, nor mouth. They tried to open the door because we felt them shake the car. I saw them looking in the car. So while this was happening, the children talked quietly and fearfully among themselves. At one point, one of these beings actually walked on the car roof, pressing down the metal. And it was during this time the temperature in the car rose sharply. And this wasn't a short incident. This actually went on for a full hour, until suddenly their friends returned in the other car. In fact, as soon as the headlights came around the corner, the 8 beings immediately retreated back into the UFO, which promptly took off. And going outside, the teenagers who were hiding in the car could now see that there were dents on the roof of the car where one of these beings had apparently walked. And as one of the witnesses said, you could hear the metallic roof press down, like under a pressure. After the departure of our visitors, we looked on the roof and there were traces. Now, they tried to keep this quiet at first. They didn't want to talk about it. They were very afraid of not being believed. But at some point, the 3 witnesses did speak about it. Researchers found out, and they told researchers exactly what happened, explained that they never wanted to have another experience like that, and that it was easily the longest hour of their lives. And in fact, the youngest said he had difficulty sleeping for a week. So that's another case that we almost didn't hear about because the witnesses were afraid of being disbelieved. And I call this one, I was completely frozen. I like this case because it involves multiple events, multiple witnesses, and a really unusual ET who is behaving in ways that are very, very strange. This one occurred on January 14, 2014, so relatively recent, and it occurred in Saint-Zenan, and this is in Lanaudière in Quebec, Canada. And as we shall see, a very interesting case. It was 2:45 in the morning of December 29, 2013, when the main witness, Madame L, does not want to use her first name. She was suffering from insomnia and was in the living room and noticed an intensely bright red light shining into the room. So she looked outside to see what the source was and was amazed to see a glowing disc-shaped object hovering directly above the garage, and not high up. She estimates it was about 15 to 20 feet above the garage, and she could tell because it was so close to the garage that this object was about 30 feet in diameter. And as she watched, this object emitted 5 small red glowing spheres, which descended toward the garage and appeared to enter inside of it. Now at this point, she says she was unable to move. She felt a strong headache, and she remained in this position for about 5 minutes as this craft just sat there, and then she saw these 5 red spheres emerge and move back into the craft. She did notice one odd thing. These spheres, which had all been the same size, well, now one of them was quite a bit larger than the others. After they re-entered the craft quickly departed, and she wanted to quickly run and tell her husband and kids, but she couldn't. She said she was totally incapacitated for about 20 minutes. Finally, she was able to move, woke up her husband and told him what happened. And yeah, it caused a headache, and this headache remained for 2 days. She didn't see any humanoids at this point. However, it was 10 days later, around midnight on January 14, 2014, when Madame L noticed that the garage door had been left open. She went to her husband and children and asked which of them had left the garage door open. All of them denied it. This is the main garage door, the one that can only be opened with a remote control. Now her husband went out to investigate. Her husband's name is Alain, and he went to the small door in the back and noticed that it was padlocked as it's supposed to be. So the garage door shouldn't have been able to be opened. He unlocked the door, entered the room very quietly because he could hear something going on in there and could see a light, and he was shocked to see a very strange looking figure crouched in the center of the garage. He could see that it had a glowing spot on its left palm. Another light was coming from its right palm and being exerted towards the floor. The entire body of this humanoid figure was glowing, but it looked quite strange. It looked like it was wearing a mask of some kind. He couldn't be sure, but as Elaine says, this creature was blue, gray, and white. It was hard to say because it was bright. I froze. I was completely frozen. So a very strange figure, and he noticed that its legs were also strange, shapes different than a normal person. This figure did not seem to notice Elaine and actually turned its back to him and continued to shine this weird light on the floor as if scanning it for something. But there was really nothing there, certainly nothing Elaine was aware of. But then at this point the figure seemed to become aware of Elaine, stood up, and walked directly up to him and placed its hand on his shoulder. And as Elaine said, he pushed me. He looked at me. I could see his face, if you can call it a face. Its head was rather elongated, but it seemed that it was covered with a kind of helmet. I am a tall man, but this creature was bigger than me. He did not seem to touch the ground. His legs were moving. He seemed to be touching the ground without actually touching it, to move through the air. It looked like he was lighter than us, basically. It seemed like the astronauts on the moon are a little lighter than we are. But he was running very fast. I do not know anyone who can go that speed. So this figure went right out of the garage and off into the woods. And of course Elaine went to investigate because, as he says, I wanted to see if he'd left any tracks in the snow. I went back to see. There were no tracks. I saw something, and I can confirm that it is not human. So this case was fully investigated. There was a 60-page or so report on all the details of this case, which is very, very unusual. What I like about that case is that it was very well investigated. The witnesses had quite a prolonged encounter, not only with the craft, but with the actual humanoid. And the fact that they were able to draw the humanoid in detail really gives you a sense of exactly what it looked like. And just so strange. And they described things we hear so often with these very advanced technologies using light. The fact that the humanoid was able to float off the ground, move much more quickly than any normal humanoid. It's also really interesting that this humanoid actually apparently used the garage remote control. So that alone makes this case, in my mind, quite unusual and high strangeness for sure. And the first case I'd like to talk about today, I call USO with humanoids. And this occurred way back in August of 1914 over Georgian Bay. This is in Ontario, Canada. It's quite an unusual case, and I think you'll find it quite interesting. The primary witness in this case is William J. Keel, then 16 years old, though some accounts have him at 18. Either way, it was late in the afternoon one day in August 1914, and William was with two other kids camping near the waters of Georgian Bay, again in Ontario, Canada. Along with them was a family with 3 small children. Suddenly, one of them saw a deer staring out at the water, and following its gaze, they all saw a strange craft with humanoids on it, floating out on the surface of the water. This craft was only about 450 feet from shore, so quite close. They said it was shaped kind of like a flattened sphere or like a bell jar, about 15 feet high. They said it had a flat gray surface, a chrome-colored ring-like structure around the bottom, and colored lights on it. At the bottom of the craft were 2 short men. They estimate about 4 feet tall, both dressed in tight-fitting, iridescent purple-green jumpsuits with yellow box-shaped helmets on their heads. Both these little guys had skinny bodies and oversized heads, and they appeared to be manipulating a green hose, which emerged from a door in the center of the craft and hung down into the water. And it looked to William like they were trying to work out the kinks in the hose, which was about 2, maybe 3 inches in diameter, with a rounded device on the end of it. Now on top of the craft were what looked like 3 short pipes or rods. William could actually see through the hatch where the hose was coming out into the craft itself and saw what looked like bright green tiles. Now I'll just let William describe a little bit of this in his own words. As he says, "I saw this deer about 12 feet from the water's edge looking out on the bay, and I looked out and saw this object. There were 2 little men with square masks on their heads working with some kind of hose coming out of the water and going up into the machine. There was a green zigzag around the center like it might be electricity traveling around, and a bright silver band around the other side." So, after watching for a few minutes, the witnesses observed 3 more little men appear from the top of the craft. These 3 also had yellow box-shaped helmets, but they wore khaki-colored clothing. They were working with the 3 pipes on the top of the craft, which William thought might be manipulating the hose or connected to it in some way. But after a few moments, the 3 men on top of the craft turned and looked piercingly at the deer, not seeming to notice the humans who were watching them too. At least that was William's impression. But as soon as they saw the deer, they quickly went back inside the craft, at which time the pipes on top of the craft also retracted into it. One of the little men on the bottom of the craft jumped inside the hatch, but the hatch closed before the other little man could get inside, and very quickly this craft began to rise from the water. In fact, it rose so quickly, the water that was on the bottom of the craft streamed back into the bay. And this one little guy who didn't get back inside was still hanging outside of the craft, clinging to this chrome ring at the base of the craft, clinging desperately, it appeared to William. And this craft rose about 15 feet, and at this point William could see a strange sort of lattice work of what looked like square metal on the bottom. And as he says in his own words, "It must have gone to a larger ship somewhere, because it seems too small to have traveled millions of miles from another planet by itself. It was not from this planet." At this point, the craft tilted at an angle, rose upward at an angle, trailing steam, and moved rapidly out of sight, with that one little man still holding desperately onto the outside of the craft. Everyone who saw this was very much startled by the incident, and yet, strangely, none of them talked about it, though William says he often thought of this little man who had been locked outside and wondered what became of him. So what a fascinating case that was. I do wonder, as the witness says, what happened to the humanoid? It sounds like that UFO, that USO, got out of that location in a hurry for some reason. But it's certainly an interesting case because there aren't a whole lot of USO cases that involve humanoids. But that's definitely one of them, and it's super fascinating. We are looking at Chicoutimi in Quebec, Canada. This is by special request of Mike. Going all over the world here. Canada has definitely got its share of encounters. Chicoutimi, I didn't find a whole lot, but I found some, and I certainly think you will find them compelling. The first case I found in Chicoutimi involved a humanoid. It was about 8 p.m. one evening in April 1968, as a lady by the name of Miss Tremblay left her Chicoutimi home to go visit a restaurant. And as she left her home, she dropped her bag and looked up, saw a UFO. This object, she said, was only 300 feet above her, very low. It was sending down a beam of light. It appeared to be scanning the area. That was her impression. And then suddenly this beam of light came down directly on her. It was very bright. It caused her to close her eyes. Opening them moments later, she looked up. This UFO was now gone. So she returned inside her home, and just a few minutes later she saw something white moving outside her home, and turning to look at it, she saw this small human-like being, only 6 feet away from her. She said that he appeared to be about 50 to 55 years old, but she was mostly struck by his dark blue eyes, which had this expression of sadness. This being was wearing a seamless white overall, no zippers, no buttons. But before she could alert anyone else in the house, this being vanished, and that was the end of the sighting. Another very interesting case comes from a Miss William Desneiges. It was around 1 a.m. on July 12, 1970, that she was in her home located on 61 Rue Vincent, which you can see here. And I'll just quote the witness directly. As she says, "I never believed in these stories before I saw this machine just 45 feet above the neighboring house. It seemed to move towards me. It had 4 arms in the form of a cross, and they were luminous. In the center was a rather strong telescopic light. It approached me, then departed calmly without making any noise. And I am not one of these young people who dream in color, I can assure you. I was not even in bed yet." One other case, very brief, occurred on October 14, 2003, and was reported to the National UFO Reporting Center. The witness said that he saw a very large cylindrical-shaped object. He said it was 30 to 40 feet long and was flying, quote, really fast. He said it was only about 100 to 200 feet overhead, and off it went. So there's no other information about this case, but certainly intriguing. And now we move to our next case. Moving through time, this next case I call the alien at the ice skating rink. This is a single witness case, though it does involve some very interesting physical evidence. It occurred on November 28, 1972. This one occurred in Canada, more specifically in La Sarre, Quebec, Canada. And it's an unusual case for sure. It was a cool sunny morning around 10:30 a.m., again on November 28, 1972, when 9-year-old Mario Mercier was ice skating on a natural sort of ice rink next to his home. There were little goalies set up. This is where people played hockey. And he watched with astonishment as a strangely spherical, quote, white cloud dropped rapidly from the sky and landed next to his house about 700 feet away. And it was a tiny little thing, about 7 feet in diameter, but all misty, so he wasn't sure what this thing was. And he became even more shocked when 3 beings, each about 4 feet tall, emerged from this, quote, cloud. These beings were clothed entirely in black and looked almost robotic. They had very square-cut shoulders, black square helmets. One of them was carrying a small black object in its hand, which Mario said looked to him like a kettle. And to his amazement, this being bent down and began to fill this container with snow. At that point, the figure walked over to Mario's chicken coop and started to open the door. At this point, Mario completely freaked out, and he actually cried out audibly. And apparently hearing Mario, this being turned towards him and realized he was being observed. Mario was frightened and hid in the hockey net at the end of the rink as this being quickly went back and joined the other 2 beings all of who climbed back into this cloud-like object, which then rose straight up and was gone. So clearly not a cloud. But at this point, Mario ran home, told his family what happened, and they came out and all of them saw strange square footprints in the snow. Also, where this object had landed, they found a 10-foot diameter of black soot and burned vegetation. And in fact, this mark remained for 2 years, and no grass would grow there during that time. What I like about that case is, again, it's a daylight case, a landing. The witness saw this object quite close. The ETs described are very unusual, the rare, perhaps robotic type, though we can't be sure. That could have just been your typical sort of space suit. But certainly interesting also because the ETs behaved in ways that we do often see, scooping up water, or in this case snow, investigating the chicken coop. And really compelling is the fact that this object apparently left physical evidence, not to mention the footprints, which were seen by the witness's family. So, very interesting details all around with that case.